All right, hey, welcome back. This is chapter 2. Going to knock this out pretty quick. There's a number of slides, but most of them are pretty self-explanatory. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time covering each individual slide. What we're looking at here is the Constitution and the origins of American government. So you guys are probably familiar, hopefully a little bit, with the Enlightenment that comes out of Europe in the late 1600s, 16 and 1700s, in which people start to question the relationship between man and government. What's the role of government in people's lives, and what obedience do people owe the government in return? And so probably the outside of Adam Locke, or not Adam Locke, Adam Smith, who we talked about last chapter, John Locke is the person that's going to have the largest influence on the United States. John Locke comes from the Enlightenment. He's an English philosopher, kind of a post-Renaissance man. Does lots of different things, but Locke witnesses a really important event in history. He witnesses the end of the English Civil War, which sees the English people rise up against what they consider a tyrannical king and Charles I, and they actually execute him. They chop his head off, and John Locke is in the audience for that event. And so he sees this as a verification of the idea of natural rights being more powerful than this idea of divine right, which was how monarchs used to see their claim to rule. Where are we at? Oops. And so these natural rights that people have, they're rights that are given by God, and they can't be taken away. And so we're going to call them, in the American Declaration of Independence, we're going to call them inalienable rights. They're just natural rights. They're life, liberty, and property. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's going to change that last one, property, and he's going to call it the pursuit of happiness, right? And so these inalienable rights are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And by the time we get to writing the Constitution, Jefferson's in France as an American emissary, and he's going to not be there for the writing of the Constitution, and James Madison is going to revert that back to life, liberty, and property. And even outside of Locke, the book talks about the Magna Carta as a symbol of self-government or of limited government. And that's true. In 1215, a bunch of British nobles got tired of being pushed around by their king, and so they invited the king to go out on a hunting expedition. And basically got him out in the woods and said, hey, look, either you sign these papers that grant us things like trial of jury by our peers or habeas corpus, where we can't be thrown in jail without being told why we're being imprisoned, or you're not going to come back. And so, like, obviously you can see, at least in England, there's some kind of a history of replacing kings that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So when we get to 1688, this is another important year because England has a civil war. They go through a period of commonwealth, and then they don't know what to do. And so then they bring back in two monarchs. They bring in Charles I, who was the son of, Charles II, who was actually the son of the king that they killed. And then he passes away, and then they have James II, and James II is problematic again, and they try to get rid of him. And so what they do is they actually reach out to James II's daughter, who was married. She's married to a German prince, and they're like, "Hey, would you like to be king and queen of England?" And the answer to that is yes, if you're living in Germany as a minor noble. And so they show up in England, and basically James runs away. And before William and Mary can become king and queen of England, they're forced to sign the English Bill of Rights, which lists rights that are enjoyed by the English subjects. And so, I mean, these are things like representation for taxation, and that Parliament is going to control spending, and that the king has to respect the rules of Parliament, and Parliament has to be in place on a regular basis. And so all these things are just limiting royal power. And so what we're really getting into here, this is a lot of rigor, Moran, I guess. what we're really getting into is this idea of a social contract. And this is one of the ideas of Locke. It's actually it's an idea of a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers. Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau all discuss this idea of a social contract in which people give up some freedoms, and they consent to be ruled in exchange for protection of life, liberty, and property. Like, obviously, I drive a minivan. I know, don't be jealous. Don't be jealous. It's okay. I drive a minivan, and that thing can haul, man. It can do a good 85, 90 miles an hour. And so it's my right. I have the ability to drive 90 miles an hour almost anywhere I go, right? But I need to give up some of those rights for the protections of others. So I can't drive through, I live in Hutchinson, Kansas, so I can't drive through downtown Hutchinson at 90 miles an hour because I could run into somebody, I could kill somebody, whatever. So I exchange my right of being able to drive as fast as I can to being able to drive as fast as I should to protect others and to create security and protection for others in society. So I'm giving up my rights or my abilities or my freedoms for the better good, and that's that social contract. The idea that Locke has, though, that is relatively new, is that if a government doesn't do its job, and it's the responsibility of the people to replace it. So once a government becomes tyrannical or doesn't respect the rights of the people, therefore the people have a responsibility to revolt. Now, this is an American government class. And so one of the questions I always ask my kids when we talk about this thing is, how often do we have revolts in America? And everybody's like, no, we never have. We had the revolution and that was it, and the Civil War. But in reality, we have small revolutions every 6 months. You have elections every 6 months in which you can replace members of the government. Every 2 years, you can replace your member of House of Representatives. Every 6 years, you can replace your senators. Every 4 years, you get to replace the whole presidential administration, the executive branch of the government, if you want. And so you can have small revolutions constantly in the United States system to replace this government without having to take up arms. And so that's one of the goals of the framers when they were writing this Constitution, is to allow change in government without revolution. Okay. This idea of social contract and self-government comes to the United States in a couple different forms. The first one is the House of Burgesses in Virginia. As early as Jamestown is founded, there's some sort of representative government there overseeing the town. The other example that gets thrown around a lot is the Mayflower Compact, which is a list of laws that were agreed upon by the Pilgrims before they got off of the boat. And if you remember your Charlie Brown special from Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims were actually supposed to land in Virginia, but they got blown off course to New England and to Plymouth. And so they were entering into an unclaimed territory. They were creating their own nation or their own place, and eventually they get swallowed up by England. But when they're stepping off of that boat, there are no rules. And so they're like, hey, we need to have rules written down before we get off this boat and figure it out. Okay, so by 1776, when the Americans declare their independence from England, America and the American colonies have been under English control for well over 100 years in America. 1618, I think, is when Jamestown gets settled. That's our first successful settlement. And so, I mean, you're looking at 150 years that the Americans colonists have been in the New World. And it's nice for England because the colonists don't cost England really any money. They pretty well take care of themselves. There's a couple troops here and there, maybe just the Navy stops by the port of Boston or Philadelphia, but they don't have any like large forts in the New World. Canada and the fishing of Canada and the fur trade of Canada are really kind of, well, I guess England doesn't own Canada at that point. The fishing off the northern part of the United States is the moneymaker for England at this point. It's not anything the colonists are doing. Even Jamestown with tobacco, people are getting rich and trading back and forth, but like that's not England's only thing it's got going on. It has colonies all over the world. And so this like nice little colony in the New World, these Americans, they're nice, but England doesn't tax them. They really don't impose any laws. They have laws on the books, but they don't do anything. They're kind of like college kids that come home for the summertime. Yeah, there's rules of the house, but like the parents don't really, batten down on them unless there's really big problems. And that big problem is going to come about in 1763 when the British and the French get in what's known as the 7 Years' War. It's a global conflict between the British and the French for control over places like North America and India and different outposts in Asia. And so the French have citizens that live in Canada. They have small forts up there for trade. And the British have to respond to this. And the French have made allies with the Native Americans. And so the Native American troops and the French troops see an opportunity to possibly either get rid of the British off of North America, or at least bottle up British expansion and keep them trapped between the Eastern Seaboard and the Appalachian Mountains. The British had been, American settlers, American colonists have been moving over these Appalachian Mountains, trying to expand for quite some time, and then run into problems with the French and the natives. And so the 7 Years' War, we call it the French and Indian War, ends up with a victory for the British. And the British get all of North America. We kick France out, for the most part, out of Canada. The French are going to hold the Louisiana Territory. But this war is going to cause a change in the relationship, because all of a sudden we have the French that are still out in the American West. Yes or no? Like there's some forts out there, right? We have settlers that want to come over the Appalachian Mountains, which means the British have to send over troops to protect this new West of, from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. The British also had to protect colonists from natives in Canada. And so all of a sudden it's starting to cost money. And England just fought this 7 years global conflict, which is costly. War costs money. And so how are we going to do this? Well, one of the ways we're going to start to tax all of our colonists. And one of the this is the first direct tax that the colonists face as a colony of England. And the colonists don't have representation in Parliament. In fact, one of the rallying cries of the American Revolution is no taxation without representation. However, you can go back into the letters sent from our founding fathers, and they don't want representation in Parliament, because if they get representation, then they can't claim that they don't have representation. And if they do have representation in Parliament, they're going to be voted down because they're such a minority. And so one of the things that, like, when they would send emissaries over to talk to England, one of the specific instructions was not to accept representation in Parliament. So anyways, the first attempt at taxation is the Stamp Act, which puts a royal stamp on paperwork for like land deeds or marriage or divorce or whatever. And the colonists get all upset and they protest, and then the Stamp Act gets repealed. But then we have the Townshend Act, which puts more taxes on all kinds of British items that are imported, and the colonists again get upset and they boycott, and then things start to get out of control, and we have the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts that start to shake down tax collectors. And so in 1770, the British send troops to restore order, and we have the Boston Massacre, where the British troops open up and they kill 5 American citizens. And things after the Boston Massacre, everything kind of settles down for a little bit, but then the British impose basically a forced government monopoly on tea with the British East India Company. And the Americans start to boycott tea because they would smuggle in tea and sugar from molasses and all these other things. And at Boston Harbor, the Bostonians get upset and they decide that they're going to throw the tea off the boat, and they do, and do basically I think it's like $10 million or $100 million worth of property damage in today's money with the Boston Tea Party, and that results with the coercive acts or the intolerable acts, where they shut down Boston Harbor and they suspend local governments from meeting. And then the colonists start to form militias, and then we have Lexington and Concord, where the militias and the English get in a fight, and then by May of 1775, it's realized that we probably got to come up with some kind of a new a goal for what's happening in the country. And so the Second Continental Congress meets. The first one actually met and sent representatives over to England to discuss problems, and nothing came of it. Okay, so we all are aware by July 4th, 1776, that we signed the Declaration of Independence, and then in 1783, the Americans win independence from England. So that's a real fast history of the American Revolution. All this is not a history class. This is a government class. So what are we going to do? How are we going to rule ourselves as this new nation? And the first attempt at this is the Articles of Confederation. It's the first formal government of the United States, and it creates a really weak federal government, and it puts all the power in the state governments. The federal government could declare war, coin money, or borrow money, and exchange ambassadors. But the problem is they can't coin money because they don't have any, and they can't borrow money because no one will lend them any money, because they can't tax anybody to raise money. They can't impose tariffs. They can't raise money anyway, other than just asking states for money. And that never works. You guys are coming out of high school, or just, you guys can think back to high school when you ask your parents for $40, you might get 5, right? Like it's not a situation where you get what you ask for. So the national government, hey, calls up Virginia, and they're like, hey, Virginia, I got to pay back England for this loan, or France for this loan, or whatever. And Virginia's like, oh, sorry to hear that. I'm all tied up. And so Virginia, won't give the federal government money, and the national government can't raise an army. And so this is going to create a problem if you have domestic instability, and that's going to raise its head in an incident called Shays' Rebellion, in which a former officer in the American Revolution, Daniel Shay, is a farmer out in Western Massachusetts. And Massachusetts starts to pass laws requiring Western farmers to pay tax bills in gold and silver. And there's no hard money in the American colonies during this time frame. Everything is like paper money or barter systems. And it's gonna, this change in law is gonna cause a problem. And sorry, I got a spot on my computer screen there. So these farmers, led by Daniel Shay, rise up and they start to burn down tax collection houses, and they actually try to form their own country, and they actually reach out to England and France to recognize them as their own nation. And then the Massachusetts governor basically asked other states, hey, can you help me form a militia to put down this revolt? And nobody sends any help. And so the governor has to turn to wealthy citizens, and Massachusetts is one of the wealthiest of the colonies, or of the early states, I guess. And they're successful in putting down Shays' Rebellion. They capture Shay. He dies of dysentery in jail. But the revolt is not really all that necessarily important. I mean, everybody gets it. Everybody's upset about money and monetary policy. And it's going to replay itself again in the Whiskey Rebellion shortly after we ratify the Constitution and elect George Washington as president. We'll have another uprising in Western Pennsylvania this time, based on this idea of money and taxation, but whatever. But what this does is it shows a need for a stronger national government, because if Shays' Rebellion would have spread to other states, there's no national response to this. There's only, the militia that's basically paid, it's private militia paid for by rich citizens of Massachusetts. And so this constitutional convention is called for in May of 1770 or 87 to discuss the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation. And they actually call one before that, I think in 1786, and nobody shows up. And so they're like, all right, well, hey, we're going to meet again, and we're going to outline what we're going to do a little better. And so they get representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies. I don't think Rhode Island doesn't send anybody, if I remember right. And it's just decided that, it would just be easier to start over than to change this Articles of Confederation, because you would have to have all 13 colonies vote unanimously to change the Articles of Confederation. And that's just difficult to do when you're asking states to give up power to the national government. And so the problems that are going to come out about this Constitution are, the first ones is you're going to have small states like I don't know, New Jersey that are going to be fighting against large states like large, powerful states like Virginia or New York. You have the issue of slavery in the South. You have this idea of state sovereignty versus federal sovereignty. Do we want a strong central government? Do we want a strong state government? How are you going to do this? And then how are we protecting individual rights of American citizens when we just fought we just fought a war we just fought a war against a king that we thought was a tyrant. Are we going to just turn around and give all the power to another tyrant? And so how are we going to secure those individual liberties while protecting social stability? Okay, and so the book does a nice job of talking about the compromises that take place. So we're just going to go about them really, really quick. The first one is going to be the Great Compromise, or sometimes it's called the Connecticut Compromise. I think it's proposed by Roger Sherman. I think that's right. I'm not going to look it up, but I think that's right. In which Virginia originally proposed the idea that states should have representation. We should have a bicameral legislature with a House of Representatives and the Senate, or a lower and upper house, and both of those houses should be elected representation based on population. So Virginia is probably one of the most populous states at that point. It's going to have the most power. A state like New Jersey proposes a plan that we should have a unicameral legislature, so one house, una, versus bi, which is two, a unicameral legislature, and we're going to base that on equality. And there's some fighting back and forth between big states and small states, and finally Connecticut and Sherman come up with this idea of that might be Sheridan, it doesn't matter. Connecticut comes up with this idea of the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, in which the House of Representatives are going to be awarded seats based on population, and everybody's going to get at least one. And then the Senate, which will be the upper house of the national legislature, will have 2 seats regardless of population. The issue of slavery is settled with a 3/5 compromise. The South, or actually most of the states at this point have some kind of slavery, although states like Pennsylvania and New York are working to abolish slavery, either gradually or just through emancipation. We're going to have a 3/5 compromise. So anybody held in enslavement, any persons held in bondage, are going to count as 3/5 of a person. So if you have 5 slaves, you get to count 3 of those individuals for representation. The compromise for that would be that the federal government could tax those 3 people. Can use that as a basis for tax, but it never actually happens. And then this idea of federal supremacy and individual liberties are going to be handled with separations of powers and checks and balances. And the book does a nice job of that, discussing it, where you have a law that can be vetoed by the president, and the presidential veto can be overridden by the legislature. The president can be removed from office through the legislature. The Supreme Court can rule on the constitutionality. Actually, it wasn't originally that way, but the Supreme Court can rule on the constitutionality of a law based on the ruling in Marbury versus Madison. So it can override Congress and the president there. The president gets to select or propose members for the Supreme Court, and Congress gets to elect them or approve them, I guess, for life. Okay. The book runs through all the different powers. So federal and state powers. We have the powers of the federal government are they're able to declare war, coin money, deal with foreign relations, set up trade, tariff or treaties, those types of things. You have reserve powers, which are just for the states, and those typically focus on interstate commerce and marriage. And then you have the supremacy clause, where the book talks about a bunch of different clauses. But the supremacy clause is this idea that the federal law is supreme to states. It also talks about the necessary and proper clause, where if if it's not an explicit power given to the federal government, but it's an implied power, Congress should be able to oversee things. So like the Supreme Court ruled that if Congress can coin money, well, then they should probably be able to have a bank or run a bank so they have a place to put it, those types of things. The ratification of the Constitution, they do a nice, the text does a nice job talking about this. Once the Constitution is written and proposed, you have two groups that come about. You have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are going to be supporting that because the Constitution provides a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists don't like that because it's going to, they want to have a strong state government. Smaller states tend to support the Constitution more than larger states because larger states are giving up more power. New York and Virginia are two of the bigger states that have to get one over to this position. And Massachusetts, who had to deal with Shays' Rebellion, is in favor of the Constitution right from the get-go. Now, Massachusetts is kind of the outlier because it's a smaller state, but it's also, you know, probably the third most important, if not the second most important state in the Union at this time. And it's one of the wealthiest. So even though it's smaller, it's willing to give up that the power it does have because of Shays' Rebellion. So you're looking at Federalists. These are typically elite members of society. They're well-educated landowners. They're businessmen. These are going to be the movers and the shakers. These are the people that we talked about in the elite theory of government. And they support this idea of a strong national government better able to defend itself and meet the problems of a growing nation. And to establish trade and those things with foreign nations. The Anti-Federalists, you're going to have some wealthy people, but a lot of them are going to be, you know, like kind of populist guys, you know, maybe farmers that are small farmers, but kind of like big thinkers. I think Thomas Jefferson probably would have fallen into this Anti-Federalist idea, but he's away in France during this time frame. And most are going to distrust the elites. They're going to believe in strong government would only help the elites. It's not going to help the common person. And they believe that a local state government that's closer to the people is going to be better able to react to their needs. Okay. Both sides are going to push out essays and cartoons all over the country. The book talks about the Federalist Papers, and it lists, I think it lists 5 specifically. I'm going to leave that up for you to go through, and they're just little short paragraphs where they describe what they talk about. We're probably going to read one of these for our assignment for this chapter, but probably the most famous of these 5 are going to be either Federalist number 10 or Federalist number 2. So make sure that you can at least identify those or know where you can look them up in the book because you'll see those on the test. The ratification of the Constitution, New Jersey and Delaware, 2 of the smaller states, are the first to ratify. Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts are going to follow. Pennsylvania is probably one of the, again, if you have a top 4, Pennsylvania's in that of the most powerful states. You have Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. New Hampshire is the 9th state to ratify, which means 3/4 of those states have accepted the Constitution. And that means there's 4 states that are left out. Virginia comes about shortly after New Hampshire in June of 1770 or 88. New York follows a month later, Carolina a year after New York, and Rhode Island is the last of the original 13 to ratify the Constitution. And so looking at political theories, these are the states that originally could have rejected joining the Union. But once they joined the Union, they don't have a right to leave it. That's one of the things that's going to be settled in the Civil War. And so these 13 have this idea that if they don't want to join the Union, they can avoid it. But once they do, they're stuck. Okay. How can the Constitution be changed through this amendment process? There's 2 ways to change the Constitution. The first one is 2/3 of the House and the Senate can propose and pass a amendment to the Constitution, and then they send it to the states. And then you can either have 3/4 of the state legislature or 3/4 of the states hold their own conventions and vote on it. When we originally passed the Constitution, we did this with the state conventions. and we allow people to elect officials to go to these state conventions and vote. The framers thought that was the best way to put the common people in charge of this new government. The second way, which has never happened, is 2/3 of the states can petition Congress with a proposed amendment, and then Congress would vote on that. And they get 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate. Then they can return it back to the states, either for a state legislature or a state constitutional convention. The first changes that are going to come to the Constitution are this this idea of a Bill of Rights. Some of the states, like Virginia, were hesitant to sign the Constitution because of a lack of written out rights. And so Madison promised to go back and write a Bill of Rights for the Constitution. He actually proposes 19 amendments, and 12 of those pass Congress and get sent out to the states. States. And then 10 of them get ratified and become the Bill of Rights. Actually, the 27th Amendment was one of this original 12. And so it was an outstanding amendment for a long period of time. Okay, so I just went through and actually stole these off of a PowerPoint someplace. But the First Amendment guarantees 5 freedoms: religion, speech, press, and petition. Those are your 5 most important rights. The Second Amendment, of course, is the right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia. The third is to not quarter soldiers in times of peace. You don't have to house soldiers in times of peace. These are objections. The Third Amendment is an objection to what happened before the War of Independence. The Fourth Amendment is it protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures. That means that police have to get, or federal officials have to get, a search warrant. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process. It also guarantees that you can't. Let's see. The Fifth Amendment protects people from being held for committing a crime unless they were properly indicted. You have to be, if you're imprisoned, you have to be charged with the crime. You can't be tried twice for the same crime. You don't have to self-incriminate yourself, and your life, liberty, or property can't be taken away from you without going through the process of law. That's what the idea of due process is. The Sixth Amendment is right to a speedy and public trial, an impartial jury, right? And the right to have a lawyer. The Seventh Amendment, where are we at? Is the right to trial by jury of your peers. The Eighth Amendment outlaws excessive bail or cruel or unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment, we're going to look through that. That is going to protect the rights not mentioned in the Constitution. So all rights that are not given to the government belong to the people. And the 10th Amendment basically guarantees any right that's not spelled out as a power of the federal government belongs to the state governments. These are the reserved rights. Okay. The 11th Amendment limits suits against states. This is kind of like, so Canada can't sue Maine. They can sue the United States and take that to an international court, but they can't sue an individual state. The 12th Amendment took care of one of the issues with our election process before the election of 1800. We really didn't have any problems because Washington gets voted for unanimously, and Adams and Jefferson, or Adams wins. But then this election of 1800, you don't run a presidential ticket. People just have a list of people they vote for. And so we end up with a tie. And before, it was the winner got, the person that got the most votes became president, and second place became vice president. But then you end up in a weird situation like Adams and Jefferson, where Adams is president and then Jefferson is the vice president, and they are in opposite political parties and opposite political beliefs, and they absolutely just hate each other. And so, I mean, you would have a situation like, today you would have Joe Biden as president and Donald Trump as vice president. And it just creates a hostile work environment, I suppose. And so we changed that to where presidents and vice presidents run on the same ticket. 13th Amendment comes after the Civil War, and that abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment defines what citizenship is and naturalized citizenship, and gives citizenship to African Americans. It ensures that individual states can't deny citizenship. And then we also have equal protection and due process that extends not only in the federal, basically the 14th Amendment extends the 5th Amendment to the state levels. And so equal protection and due process are now enforced at state levels, not just on the national level. 15th Amendment gives African-American males the right to vote. 16th Amendment comes about during the Progressive Era, which allows the federal government to collect income tax. 17th Amendment allows direct election of senators. Before that, senators were selected by state legislatures. And so it puts the government more in the hands of the common people. 18th Amendment prohibits alcohol. 19th Amendment, women get the right to vote. The 20th Amendment, we change when the president takes office. We change from March 4th to January 20th. And so basically what that does is it just speeds up the transition period in times of crisis. This comes about because of the Depression. Herbert Hoover was a lame duck president from November until March, which is November, December, January, February, March, for 5 months or 4 months versus 2-month transition is much easier. The 21st Amendment repeals the 18th. The 22nd Amendment sets term limits for the president at 2. If you're vice president and you take over for somebody, you can serve a total of 10 years. Washington, D.C. gets the right to vote in presidential elections in the 23rd Amendment. Poll tax gets outlawed in the 24th Amendment, which again opens up or which strikes down one of the vehicles used to prevent African Americans from voting in the South. 25th Amendment lays out the line of secession. The 26th Amendment gives the legal right to vote for 18-year-olds who are males, at least, are drafted into the Army. And so during Vietnam, it was problematic for males to be going to war but not have a voice in their government. The 27th Amendment basically says, this is one of the original that was proposed, says that Congress can't vote an increase to its salary until the beginning of the next term. And so if you're a congressman, you can't give yourself a raise before you stand before the people that are paying your salary and ask for that raise. And so you look at 15th, 17th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, 26th, all of those amendments deal with putting the democratic process in the hands of the people and allowing more people to participate in government. So we're expanding the electorate there. That's chapter 2 in a nutshell. This isn't going to replace you actually reading the chapter. Please go through and do that. Take the chapter quiz, and I will see you guys with chapter 3 next week. If you have any questions, reach out to me.